want to say a couple things about Soo Ji. She's going to tell you more about herself. When I first met her was at our Women's Holiness Clergy event, and I went to her workshop. And she has a lot of work she does with that group, and so she's up front doing things. And so here's how I would explain it. She was one of the cool kids, right? And I'm like, I would love to get to know her because she's one of the cool kids. And so when she said yes to being willing to do this, it just thrilled my heart. And she has a real gift for planning and for curating spaces and worship experiences. So Saturday morning, you won't want to miss the cool things we're going to do, and a lot of those came from her ingenuity. She is really fun to follow on social media because it's a trip. She is originally born in Korea. Her husband is of Mexican heritage, so she calls her children Mexarians, and it's just really entertaining. So her husband and Joe and Soo Ji pastor a church in California, and they're both incredibly gifted. We got to hear from him some at General Conference. So I'm going to go ahead and have her come up, and she will share her story with you, and from here on, she's in charge.
Yes. Amen. Well, good morning. Wasn't that a good word that Brother Scott brought this morning? Praise God for the early church. Praise God that they persevered in the face of persecution for doing what the Lord had called them to do. So I'm just thankful to be here today. It's a privilege and an honor to be back in Rochester. I believe 8 years ago I was here during General Conference at Roberts Wesleyan, and that was a joy to get to experience the town, to go eat a garbage plate, to walk by the canal, went to Dinosaur Barbecue, and just had an amazing time. So it's good to be back. My journey from Riverside, California to here took about 24 hours. There were so many things that happened along the way, but I know that God's timing is perfect. And his purpose and reasons and will, they all make sense even when it doesn't make sense to us. So I'm just thankful to be here. I was grateful for Kathy inviting me. And, she made it a point when she invited me to say, now, we really need somebody with an Asian perspective, so will you come? And I said, I would love to come. I would love to do that. So I'm here today as your crazy, not rich Asian. So buckle in your seatbelts. I get to share my story. I'm excited about that. I'm married to my husband. He's Mexican-American. He was born and raised in Las Vegas. And the area of town where he was raised in North Las Vegas, it's a rough neighborhood. He grew up around a lot of gang violence, saw a lot of things happening. His mom still lives in that neighborhood when we go to visit them. And we were watching Cops one day, and it was the Vegas edition. I was like, look, honey, that's your mom's block right there. I mean, it was rough. And so he grew up with a very different perspective. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada. I was born in Busan, South Korea. My parents immigrated to Vancouver, Canada. And it's, I was just thinking about that story and just wondering, like, what would I be like if I had never immigrated, if I had still been living in South Korea? And, I'm so thankful that God brought me here to this space and that I was able to have the chance to be able to enjoy the beauty and the people of Vancouver, Canada. And then when I graduated from high school, I moved down to Seattle, Washington to go to university at Northwest University. It's an Assembly of God college in Kirkland, and to minister. And so it was in ministry in Seattle where I met my husband. And from the moment we met, we were doing ministry together, and we fell in love, with the Free Methodist Church, and got married. It was exciting. So currently we're in Riverside, California, and we've been there for 3 years. And Riverside is about an hour east of Los Angeles. It's one of the fastest growing counties. It's got a lot of diversity, a lot of young adults. We've got lots of different schools in that area. And so we were invited to pray about coming 3 years ago. And when we came to Riverside and we checked it out, and we just saw this beautiful church of over 100 years wanting to reach their community, and they just needed some fresh young blood, some Mexican and Korean blood to come on in. Because as you probably know, most of Southern California, that's where all the Koreans and Mexicans are anyways. And we were up in Washington. There's a lot of diversity up there, too. Actually, it blesses my heart to know that I'm standing here at New Hope, where Paul and Delia and Newshover had an impact, because I had the opportunity to serve under their leadership at Rainier Avenue Church in Seattle. And it was our first experience at a Free Methodist church, and really one of the most diverse churches in that neighborhood. And so we fell in love with the Free Methodist heritage, the values, what they were doing today, as well as what they were known for. So it's just been a privilege to be able to be a part of the Free Methodist family. We've been in Riverside for 3 years. It's been fun, a lot of bumps along the journey, but God has been faithful. And he is the one that has paved the way. And so today I want to share the story of my journey. So I'm Korean Canadian, married to a Mexican American. So life is fun in our house. Any other Asians in the house? Anybody? Anybody know what kimchi is? Yes. Then you're Asian in heart. If you've eaten kimchi, you're my people. All right. So Koreans eat kimchi. If you've never heard of it, you need to go, and I should have brought some today. That's what we should have done, is served it like communion, passed a plate of kimchi. It's basically spicy, stinky, fermented cabbage. But it's a probiotic. It's really good for your gut. It'll clear up your skin, but it's really good for you. And you can make it now out of anything. So there's kimchi, cucumber kimchi, radish kimchi. They make it out of turnips, any vegetable. So it's basically pickled, fermented, half rotten, but really good for you. So that's what kimchi is. And so when Kathy invited me to come, and I was like, okay, she needs some of my kimchi power, is really what she's saying. She needs me to come and bring some of that kimchi power with her. And if you've never heard of kimchi power, it's my translation of the Greek word dunamis, when the Holy Spirit was to come. The dunamis power that Jesus was promising was the kimchi power. And the reason why I say that is because kimchi really stinks. Like, you can take that stuff, it's bottled up and sealed with a lid. You can wrap it up in a plastic bag and then wrap it again in another plastic bag, put it in your fridge, put baking soda around it, and when you come into the kitchen, you can still smell that stuff. Okay, my kids are walking into my kitchen wondering what has died in the fridge. It's kimchi. Right? And it's not always there. I'm not that Korean. I don't know how to make it. I buy it at the grocery store. Sometimes it's in my fridge, sometimes it's not. But when it is, you know it's there, because that's the power of the kimchi. So Koreans eat it with meat, with rice, with vegetables. They eat it morning, noon, and night. I don't eat it quite that much anymore, but I knew that when I met my husband 18 years ago, and when we started dating a year later, I knew it was true love, because he kissed me, and I knew I had kimchi breath, and he still kissed me anyways. So that was the start of our journey. So as we met doing ministry together, I was so thankful that God brought me somebody that introduced me to real Mexican food, because up in Canada we don't even have Taco Bell up there. It was Taco Time was what we had. I thought that was Mexican food. And so when I met my husband, and I met my mother-in-law, and she made real Mexican food, real enchiladas and tamales and pozole and all of this amazing food, and I was like, I love Mexican food. I didn't know that, because I thought it was like a hard shell taco with shredded lettuce and diced tomatoes and ground beef. No. That was not Mexican food. And so just the beauty of our cultures coming together when we were married 14 years ago, and the blessing in the journey. God has blessed us with a son, Joaquin, who's now 12, and a daughter, Nayara, who's 10. And it's so fun to see our son growing up, and now that he's older, he looks so much like my husband. It's amazing, because when he was born, you know, he kind of, most babies have that scrunched up face, and he was really pale, and I thought, oh, he looks just like me. He pretty much looks Korean. But as he's grown older, he's started to look so much more like his dad. And so with the second child, my husband was hoping that she would turn out looking more Mexican. So he was hoping that she would have his mother's hair. His mom's got really curly afro hair and dark skin, and she came out looking exactly like me. And even as she's grown older, it's been fun to see how the mix of those genetics works, and how God takes a blend of both parents, but gives a little extra of one parent to this kid and a little bit more to this kid. And so we've loved our children. We've loved having the opportunity to minister where we're at in Riverside. But the reason why my parents moved from South Korea to Vancouver, Canada, really was because they were tired of being poor and hungry. Because the economy in Korea at that time was so depressed. And so the promise of having a better life, of being able to provide for your children. So that was the main reason why we immigrated from South Korea to Canada when I was 3. And I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know what was happening. But my parents came over with about $15 in their pocket. My dad went and took all the jobs that nobody else would do. You know, he worked in the coal mines. He did odds and ends, and they scraped by until they were able to save enough money that eventually they were able to buy their own business. And so for many years, they were very entrepreneurial. They owned a teriyaki shop, a grocery store, a sandwich shop, all these different businesses over the years. And you know, when you're growing up in that, you take that for granted. You don't see that as a blessing. You know, for me, I didn't see the availability of food, not only in my home, but even at the place of my parents' work. I didn't realize that was a blessing. You know, for them, that was a blessing to know that they weren't going hungry, and not only that, that they were providing opportunity to bless the community through the food that they were able to make and able to sell. So I grew up getting my lunch from my mom's shop. It was a really good sandwich shop. She called it the old-fashioned sandwich shop. And so that was the name for a long time. And I was like, that's interesting, old-fashioned sandwich shop. And so she would make these triple-decker sandwiches that were literally this thick. And I would go either in the morning or the day before, and I would pack my lunch for school the next day. So I always had a sandwich this thick. And I had like a candy bar and a bag of chips and a can of soda. Probably not the best lunch, but you know what? When it came to my friends at lunchtime, I was the star of the show at that moment, because they had bologna sandwiches in their bag or peanut butter and jelly. So I would eat half of my sandwich and I would trade the other half for somebody else's cookies. And so I grew up really privileged and not recognizing that and not seeing that. I also grew up in central Vancouver, which is very diverse. I was surrounded in elementary school with a lot of native First Generations people from Canada, a lot of East Indians, a lot of Asians. A lot of my friends had different cultures and ethnicities. And so growing up in that, I didn't ever really feel like I stuck out or like I didn't belong until we moved. And so right before my high school year, my parents' business was doing well, and they decided that, you know, for the sake of my education, I'm the oldest, that we were going to move to a better part of town. And so we did. We moved up to North Vancouver, which is much more upscale, really affluent neighborhood. My parents bought a storefront there. Their business was prospering and doing well, and I went to high school for the first time in a neighborhood where I really stuck out. I did not look like I belonged. And so for the first time, I started experiencing this feeling of rejection and not feeling quite like I fit in with the majority of my classmates. Most of them were up on the weekends at their family cabin skiing and hanging out. And a lot of the friends that I made at that time were a lot like me. They didn't quite fit in. And I remember most of them looking like my friends from elementary school. I had a friend, Aisha, who was East Indian, another friend, Janine, who was Japanese, Michelle was Chinese. All of these friends that I had, and I feel like for the first time that I experienced racism, both from my peers and from my teachers. And so it was this feeling of, I don't remember quite what they said, but it was this feeling that they looked down on me because of who I was as a Korean Canadian. And to know that I felt bad, even though I didn't quite know why. And so for the first time, I felt this sense of injustice. And I began to see both my privilege as an Asian Canadian, and also began to see that there is injustice in the world. And so for the first time, I felt like a foreigner in Canada. And it's funny because even though I didn't fit in at school because I was too Korean, on Sundays we went to an all-Korean church, and I didn't quite fit in there because I wasn't Korean enough, right? The Korean I spoke was funny. I probably spoke Korean with a French-Canadian accent because in Canada, you also learn French from kindergarten through 12th grade. So imagine going from no English into kindergarten, learning French and learning Korean. And I give all the credit to TV, Brady Bunch, Spider-Man, all of those shows helped me learn English. And imagine going into a setting where you've got 1 feet in both worlds. I wasn't quite fully Korean, accepted by my Korean friends at church. You know, I didn't dress the same as they did. I didn't talk the same. I wasn't into the same food and K-pop bands or dramas. And I didn't quite fit in as well with my classmates Monday through Friday at school. And so kind of living in both worlds for a period of time. And I know some of us have experienced something like that in our journey, where we just didn't quite fit in, and we're wondering, why, God? At least that's what I wondered. Why am I in this position, and why did you put me in this place? And for a while, I had some resentment against my parents for moving us. Why did they have to move us to this new school? I mean, they basically ruined my life, is what I told them. You've ruined my life by moving us to North Vancouver, not recognizing that that was part of God's direction and provision. You know, that he was providing for my parents, and he was, you know, really, I went to an amazing school where I was at. It was public education, but it was an amazing opportunity to learn. And so, you know, you kind of question and you take for granted. And I was, you know, I would even think, like, what would I be like if I had still been in Korea? I would have fit in, but would I be the same person that I am today? Would I be different? Because I did fit in over there? Or did God use my journey of immigrating from Korea to Canada and then eventually down here to the U.S. to prepare me for another journey of finding my purpose and my identity? So I don't know what you've been through, but I want to encourage you today with this word. The word that I want to bring is this, that the journey to freedom and justice, it involves the faithfulness of multiple generations courageously following God together. Now, we're all on different points along that journey, and as we blaze a trail for the next generation and the next generation, we continue to see the faithfulness of God being imparted. And so I just want to read a little bit out of Psalm 145, which says this: I will exalt you, my God, the King, and I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you and extol your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise, for his greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. So just meditate on that for a moment. The God's goodness and God's greatness is to be commended from one generation to the next and to the next. You know, as I was just thinking about, well, what could I share? And I got stuck on that phrase, that this journey to freedom, to justice, it really is not just my journey. It's all of our journeys together. All of us faithfully following God. To know that my parents left their native country, the place where they knew people and the language and the customs and the traditions. You know, they left the religion of their parents. I remember as a young child going to the Buddhist temple with my grandparents because that was their religion. And for my parents, they courageously followed God on this path, knowing that there was a promise involved in this journey. And so as they did that, they paved a way for my generation, for my kids' generation. And of course, looking back, I can see that now. And it reminds me a lot of the story of Moses in the Bible. You know, Moses was raised with all the privileges of Pharaoh's, of royalty. You know, he learned the Egyptian customs and language, and it wasn't until he was 40 years that he decided to go and see what was up with his people, with the Hebrew slaves. So he goes, and for the first time, he sees the injustice. And God has placed him in this world between two worlds. He's not quite fully accepted as an Egyptian, and he's definitely not accepted as an Israelite. the very people. And he even says to the Hebrews, God is using me to help save you, to rescue you, and they reject him. And they reject him so much that he, of course, runs away, lives life as a foreigner in another land for another 40 years before he has the experience with the burning bush. And the Lord telling him to go back and set my people free, and to realize that Moses was instrumental in the journey of freedom for the people of God at that time. And so for this reason, he starts to obey God and to go into this journey. And I want to quickly just talk about the different generations that are there, because once again, the journey to freedom and justice, it involves the faithfulness of multiple generations courageously following God together. So in the different generations that are represented in the Israelites, there's the captive generation. The captive generation were those that were enslaved in Egypt. They had been born into slavery. They had known no other life. They enjoyed their slavery because they didn't know that there was a difference. So they're trapped in these systems of injustice and oppression. The land of Egypt is cursed because of the sin of Pharaoh, and the curse of the 10 plagues happens. And, I think about our curse as a nation, to know that there are curses that are happening because of the injustice that is happening around us. And the people that were born into slavery, whether they're in Egypt at that time or today that are born into slavery, they know no better, because this is the only life they have ever lived. They don't even know that there is such a thing as the promised land. So the captive generation, they were used to slavery, didn't see that they were in chains. Their obstacles overwhelmed their freedom. They grumbled, and they also made gods for themselves. So then begins this journey of Moses helping set those people free. And so the people that left, we know this is the Exodus generation. They exited out of Egypt. They left the land of slavery. So this Exodus generation, it represents this departure to freedom. And so they knew that there was risk involved. It was the unknown. What's greater than the unknown of what's out there? Most of us would rather stay in the comfort of what's known, even if it means we're still stuck in systems of oppression or injustice. And it's this slavery mentality that even as this Exodus generation was physically set free, their minds were still stuck in this mentality of slavery. So they're wandering in the desert. These are immigrants, people coming from land to land, or refugees. And even today, to see the immigration crisis that's happening, it's heartbreaking to know that there are people that are fleeing from countries, whether it's because of economics or war, whatever it is that they're fleeing, they know that there is a better life out there, and they would rather take that chance of losing their life in order to find a better life. And so this is happening. And my immigration story, it was pretty peaceful. I mean, God was incredibly benevolent. And when I think about the crisis now that is happening at the border and in our seas, and I don't understand what it's like, because I did not live through that kind of immigration crisis. We were fully welcomed when we immigrated to Canada, and even when I came down to the States to go to college. And so it breaks my heart to see that there are people, because these children could have very well been me. It could have been me stranded at the border, wondering where my parents went. These children could have been my children. What would that be like as a parent trying to come into a new land because of the promise of the freedom and the promise of knowing that you can find justice, and to know that there is this Exodus generation that is willing to leave their people group, willing to leave their country and their culture because of that promise, knowing that they will not be accepted wherever they go, but knowing that where they're going is a whole lot better than where they came from. The interesting thing about this Exodus generation is that their culture was defined by their faith. Not by their citizenship, not by tradition, not by their language. It was their faith in the Lord that led them out. It was their faith that overwhelmed their enemy. the Egyptians. And it wasn't their numbers or their strength, but it was their faith in God as they obeyed God's command and as they trailblazed for this next generation. This Exodus generation is the one that does the hard work of leaving what they've known in order to get to that promised land. And so that next generation that they're bringing alongside with them is the promised generation. You know, I would say that my parents and I, we were part of that Exodus generation. And even then, I don't understand the hardships that my parents faced coming as adults into a country not understanding the language. My kids will never understand what it's like to go hungry, what it's like to not fit in. You know, we live in a place of great diversity in Southern California. I'm thankful that they have classmates that look like them, you know, talk like them. They've never experienced that. Now, they have experienced rejection. They have experienced racism. It still happens. You know, one of the mass shootings we had recently was targeted against Latinos. And so that, you know, that the temptation is to fear that because my kids are, you know, they're part Latino, so they look like those people that are being targeted. And it breaks my heart to know that there is this type of hatred against different people groups and this fear that controls these situations, and to know that there's biases that come along that way. Where we live is a pretty nice neighborhood, and when my husband is out in the front cutting the grass, you know, people assume that he's the gardener and not the actual owner of the house. And so as we are living in the promised land, this generation, you know, they've been born into the country, they've been given automatic citizenship, they have enjoyed the blessing of the 10 Commandments, they've never known what it's like to be hungry, to be poor, to be in slavery. But this is the only generation that reaches this promised land, that is born into the promise. They don't know the suffering of their ancestors. Their ancestors have told the stories, but they don't really understand the suffering that is there. And they've been given a new commandment, and they're reaping the blessings and the freedom that comes with that. Now, with that, they take their freedom for granted because they don't know and they don't understand the cost. And so when I began to see and feel the injustice that I faced, I began to notice that I was not alone. I began to notice that there were a whole segment of my friends who were people of color that I had disregarded and that I did not understand the level of injustice that they face compared to mine as an Asian American. And so I began to see that there was a crisis happening. When I married my husband, who's Mexican American, I began to learn more about the Latino culture, and I began to see that there were migrant families in our very community in Washington, children that were helping to harvest the berries and the crops, and that were moving around. And I didn't understand that that was all happening before I was in a relationship with somebody that had a heart for that and that had a burden for that people group. And I began to see the injustice that is continuing to happen today, this captive generation that is still caught in cycles of injustice and slavery. And you know, these children that are forced to work in the fields, I mean, it really is heartbreaking to know that that is happening right in our backyards. And it's heartbreaking to know that they're doing it because this is one of the only ways that they can provide for their families, one of the only jobs that they can get as undocumented immigrants to make a living here in America. And I started becoming more aware and asking God, why is your world this way? I know this is not your original design or intent. You know, when your child comes home and asks you what a Chinese middle finger is, I'm like, I don't know. I've never heard of a Chinese middle finger. And he tells you that somebody at school, you know, stuck up their Chinese middle finger at him because he's Asian. When this happens, we have to remember that we have the opportunity to help lead people out of slavery. We have the opportunity to help those generations, whether it's the captive generation or the Exodus generation or the promised generation, reminding them of not only the promises of God, but showing them the injustice and the cycles of slavery that are continuing to happen because they don't know and they don't understand that that's happening. So this journey to freedom, it starts with me, it starts with you. When Moses started the journey to the promised land, it wasn't just for him. As a matter of fact, he saw the promised land, but he never got there. Which tells me that the inheritance that the Lord promised was not from Moses, but it was for the generations to come after him. And I think right there is where we need to pause and realize that even if we were to never see our personal promised land, that we've got to continue to be faithful because of the generations that are coming after us. So that's my question to you today is, what is your personal promised land? What does that look like? How do you know if you've arrived? One of my own personal promised lands was seeing a woman elected bishop. Okay? Yes. Give God praise for that. Because we say that we believe that men and women are created equal and that there's no barrier or no glass ceiling for women, but it's not until I see that happening that I begin to believe it. So that was one of my personal promised lands. To see that happening, I know that I've arrived on that part of the journey. You know, for my daughter, she's hoping one day that she'll grow up and be president. You know, that's one of her personal promised lands, is seeing a woman become president of this country. And that's one of her dreams. And so what are those personal promised lands that the Lord has promised you? And how will you know that you have arrived? And what are the barriers to getting there? What are the discouragements that make you want to give up in the process? Because it just seems too overwhelming when you think about it all. So when you trailblaze like Moses did, you may never arrive there yourself, but we must continue to do that journey because we're not doing it for them. We're not doing it for just our kids. We're doing it for the generations to come. So we've got to pick up our feet. We can't drag our feet against what the Holy Spirit would have us do. We've got to pick it up and not give up. We've got to know that for most of us, the hope of seeing a person of color elected as bishop, that may be a personal promised land. When we get to that part of the journey, we know we have arrived. We can see the promise. We know it's possible because we know that God calls and appoints all people, but it's not until we have arrived that we can celebrate. And along the journey, it is discouraging. I get that because I've been discouraged. But I want to encourage you today, pick up your feet, press on, because the journey to freedom and justice, it involves the faithfulness of multiple generations courageously following God together.